My name is Rachel Wilson, and I never thought my dream home would become the center of a nightmare that began on what should have been the happiest day of my married life, our first wedding anniversary. I'm sharing this story because I want other women to recognize the signs I missed, to understand that sometimes the people closest to us can have hidden motives that only reveal themselves when it's almost too late. Growing up in Seattle, I always admired the beautiful Victorian house my grandmother owned in Queen Anne. Its wraparound porch, intricate woodwork, and bay windows represented everything I dreamed of having someday. When she passed away and left it to me, it became my sanctuary, my piece of family history, and my future. That was 3 years before I met Daniel Matthews. Dan swept into my life like a whirlwind during a charity gala at the Seattle Art Museum. He was charming, successful, and seemed to understand me in ways no one else had. Our courtship was a fairy tale. Expensive restaurants, surprise weekends away, and countless moments where he showed what appeared to be genuine care for my dreams and aspirations. We married in a beautiful ceremony at the Four Seasons, and I thought I had found my happily ever after. The first few months of marriage were everything I had hoped for. Dan supported my career as a real estate agent, and we lived comfortably in our South Lake Union apartment while I rented out my grandmother's house. But slowly, things began to change. It started with small comments about how much money we could make if we sold the Victorian house. Then came suggestions about combining our assets for our future. I always deflected these conversations, feeling uncomfortable with the idea of selling my grandmother's legacy. Looking back, I should have seen the signs. The way Dan's smile wouldn't quite reach his eyes when I talked about renovating the Victorian house. The subtle pressure to make all our financial decisions together. The increasing frequency of comments about how outdated my grandmother's house was. But love has a way of blinding us to the red flags waving right in front of our faces. The morning of our first anniversary started like a dream. Dan surprised me with breakfast in bed. My favorite, avocado toast from the local cafe and a perfect latte. He presented me with a beautiful Tiffany bracelet and announced he had made dinner reservations at Canlis, one of Seattle's most exclusive restaurants. I was touched by his thoughtfulness, completely unaware that this was all part of a carefully orchestrated plan. As we drove up to Canlis that evening, the sun was setting over Elliott Bay, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I remember feeling so grateful, so in love. Dan had requested a private dining room, making the evening feel even more special. The champagne was flowing, and the conversation was light and romantic. Then, between the main course and dessert, Dan reached into his jacket pocket. "Rachel, my love," he said, his voice smooth as honey, "I want to talk about our future." He pulled out a folder of documents, and my heart started to race. I've been thinking about how we can secure our future together, and I have everything prepared. I just need your signature to make our life perfect. As I opened the folder, my blood ran cold. They were property transfer documents for my grandmother's house. Everything was already filled out, ready for my signature to transfer full ownership to Dan. When I looked up at him in shock, his warm smile had transformed into something I'd never seen before. A cold, calculating expression that made me realize I was looking at a stranger. "Dan, I don't understand," I stammered, pushing the documents away. "This house is my heritage, my grandmother's legacy. Why would you want me to sign it over to you?" His response chilled me to the bone. "Because, Rachel, everything in a marriage should be shared. Don't you trust me? Don't you love me? This is just a formality. We're husband and wife. What's mine is yours, and what's yours should be mine." If you want to know how I escaped this situation and reclaimed not just my property but my life, make sure to subscribe to hear the rest of my story. Sometimes the biggest betrayals come wrapped in the prettiest packages, and I learned that lesson the hard way. Hit that subscribe button if you want to know what happened next, and remember, trust your instincts, even when your heart tries to silence them. The elegant private dining room at Canlis suddenly felt suffocating. The warm candlelight that had seemed so romantic moments ago now cast menacing shadows across Dan's face as he pushed the documents closer to me. His perfectly manicured fingers tapped impatiently on the thick folder, each tap echoing in my ears like a countdown. "Rachel." "Darling," he said, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "This is a simple matter. Just sign the papers and we can enjoy our dessert. The chocolate soufflé you love is already on its way." His attempt at sweetness felt artificial, like saccharin dissolving on my tongue. My hands trembled as I reached for my water glass, buying time to think. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle's skyline twinkled innocently, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in this luxurious room. The Space Needle stood illuminated against the darkening sky, reminding me of countless summer evenings spent on my grandmother's porch, watching the same view while she told me stories of her life. "I don't understand why this has to happen tonight, Dan. This is our anniversary. Why can't we discuss this another time?" My voice sounded small, even to my own ears. I watched as his jaw clenched, a tiny muscle twitching beneath his perfectly groomed 5 o'clock shadow. "Because, my love," he replied, emphasizing each word as if speaking to a child. "I've arranged everything perfectly. Our lawyer is actually waiting in the bar downstairs to notarize the documents. It's all taken care of." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing my wrist where the Tiffany bracelet he'd given me this morning rested. The contact made my skin crawl. The waiter appeared with our desserts, the chocolate soufflé rising perfectly above its ramekin. The sight of it turned my stomach. Dan dismissed him with a wave, and I watched my last connection to the outside world disappear behind the heavy wooden door. "I've been patient, Rachel. I've given you time to come to terms with combining our assets. But it's time to be practical. That old house is just sitting there, collecting dust and memories. Think of what we could do with the money from its sale. We could invest in our future, start a family." My grandmother's face flashed. In my mind, her kind eyes, the way she'd squeeze my hand when I was upset, her fierce independence until the very end. The house wasn't just a property, it was her legacy, her gift to me, filled with decades of love and memories. "Dan, that house means everything to me. You know this. Why are you really doing this?" I forced myself to meet his gaze, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. The mask of loving husband had slipped completely, revealing something calculating and foreign. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out about the trust fund attached to that property? Your grandmother was clever, I'll give her that. The house has to stay in your name for you to access those funds. But as your husband, if you transfer the property to me, we can access everything." The room spun slightly as his words sank in. The trust fund, a detail I'd never shared with him. My grandmother had set it up as a safety net, accessible only if I maintained ownership of the house. It wasn't a fortune, but it was substantial enough to ensure I'd always be independent. "How did you—" I began, but he cut me off with a sharp laugh. "I'm an investment banker, Rachel. Did you think I wouldn't do my due diligence? I've known about it since before we got married. I just needed to wait for the right moment. And what better time than our anniversary? No one would question a wife signing over property to her husband on such a romantic occasion. Or the casual cruelty in his voice made me realize how little I knew the man sitting across from me. Every loving gesture, every tender moment over the past year, had it all been calculated? Part of a long game to get access to my inheritance? "I won't do it," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "The house stays in my name. This isn't up for discussion." Dan's expression darkened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen a few times before placing it face up on the table between us. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable, but I came prepared. Take a look. The screen showed a series of photos. Me, leaving various properties with clients. Normal scenes from my work as a real estate agent. But the angles were strange, taken from cars or behind trees. I was being followed. These could look very compromising with the right narrative, Dan said softly. Imagine what your broker would think if they suggested improper relationships with clients. Your reputation would be ruined. No one would trust you to sell their home again. My hands clenched into fists under the table. You're blackmailing me? On our anniversary? I prefer to think of it as giving you motivation to make the right choice. The choice that's best for our marriage. He slid a Mont Blanc pen across the crisp white tablecloth. Sign the papers, Rachel. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. The weight of the situation pressed down on me like a physical force. My mind raced, searching for options, for escape routes. The lawyer. Waiting downstairs meant Dan had orchestrated every detail.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The anniversary dinner, the private room, the champagne, all carefully planned to corner me. I need to use the restroom, I managed to say, standing on shaky legs. Dan's hand shot out, gripping my wrist hard enough to leave marks. Don't do anything foolish, he warned. I have eyes on every exit. You have exactly 3 minutes. I pulled free from his grasp and walked as steadily as I could to the restaurant's elegant restroom. Once inside, I leaned against the marble counter, struggling to breathe. The woman in the mirror looked like a stranger, pale, frightened, her carefully applied makeup now slightly smeared. With trembling fingers, I pulled out my phone and opened my messages. I needed help, but who? Could I trust? Who would believe that my perfect husband was actually a manipulative predator? My finger hovered over Olivia's name, my best friend since college, now a lawyer herself. But before I could type a message, my phone buzzed with a text from Dan. 2 minutes. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to think clearly. The trust fund was substantial, nearly $500,000. No wonder Dan had been playing the long game. But it wasn't just about the money. My grandmother had left me that house for a reason. This is your safe haven, she'd told me before she died. No matter what happens in life, you'll always have a home here. Walking back to the private dining room felt like walking to my own execution. Dan was sitting exactly as I'd left him, the pen still waiting ominously on the tablecloth. The chocolate soufflé had collapsed, much like my illusions about my marriage. Have you made your decision? Dan asked pleasantly, as if we were discussing weekend plans rather than him destroying my life. I sank into my chair, mind racing. I needed time. Time to think, to plan, to find a way out of this nightmare. Can I at least read through the documents properly? Dan's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course, darling. I want everything to be perfectly legal. The underlying thread in his words was clear. I picked up the thick stack of papers with unsteady hands, pretending to read while my mind worked furiously. The documents were comprehensive. Not just the house transfer, but also papers giving Dan power of attorney over my affairs. He wasn't just after the house. He wanted complete control. There's something else you should consider, Dan said, his voice silky smooth. Your grandmother's house needs significant repairs. The foundation is problematic. The wiring needs updating. All very expensive issues. As your husband, I'm concerned about your safety living there. Signing these papers would really be in your best interest. The casual mention of my safety sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a concern. It was a threat. I thought about all the times over the past year when Dan had insisted on handling our finances, when he'd convinced me to close my personal bank account and merge everything into our joint account. The signs had been there all along, but I'd been too in love to see them. The soufflé's getting cold, Dan reminded me, his patience clearly wearing thin. And our lawyer has other appointments tonight. Under the table, my phone buzzed again. Without looking, I knew it was another threatening message from Dan. He had planned this ambush meticulously, leaving me no room to maneuver. Or had he? My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. Sometimes, Rachel, you have to lose a battle to win the war. She'd told me that after losing an important case in her law practice, but the lesson had stuck with me. With a deep breath, I picked up the Mont Blanc pen. Dan's face lit up with triumph, but I wasn't finished yet. I'll sign, I said quietly, but I have one condition. You're not really in a position to make conditions, Dan replied, but curiosity flickered across his face. I want to spend one last night in the house, to say goodbye properly. You can have the papers notarized first thing tomorrow morning. I met his gaze steadily, praying he wouldn't see through my desperate ploy for time. Dan studied me for a long moment, considering. That's all you want? One night? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The seconds ticked by like hours until, finally he smiled, that same cold, calculating smile that had replaced my loving husband's warm grin. Fine. One night to say goodbye to your precious memories. But I'll have someone watching the house. Don't try anything stupid. He gathered the documents back into the folder. We'll meet at the lawyer's office at 9 a.m. sharp tomorrow. Don't be late. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. Dan acted as if nothing had happened, chatting about work and future plans while I pushed food around my plate. My mind was already racing ahead, formulating a plan. I had exactly 12 hours to figure out how to save my grandmother's legacy. And myself. As we drove home, Dan's hand rested possessively on my knee. You're making the right choice, he said, squeezing slightly too hard. Sometimes we have to let go of the past to embrace the future. I stared out the window at the passing city lights, thinking about how quickly life can change. This morning, I'd woken up believing I was married to a loving man. Now, I was trapped in a car with someone who had orchestrated an elaborate plot to steal my inheritance and independence. When we pulled up to my grandmother's house, Dan insisted on walking me to the door. Remember, he whispered, pulling me close in what would look like a loving embrace to any observers. I'm watching. Don't disappoint me, Rachel. I waited until his car disappeared around the corner before letting myself into the house. The familiar scent of old wood and my grandmother's lingering lavender potpourri wrapped around me like a comforting embrace. Everywhere I looked held memories. The scratched hardwood floors where I'd learned to roller skate, the bay window, where I'd spent countless hours reading, the kitchen where my grandmother had taught me to bake her famous apple pie. Moving through the rooms like a ghost, I began to formulate a plan. Dan had underestimated me, just as he'd underestimated my grandmother. She hadn't just left me a house, she'd left me the tools to protect myself, if only I was brave enough to use them. I had 12 hours until my meeting with Dan and the lawyer. 12 hours to save everything my grandmother had worked for. 12 hours to prevent myself from becoming another woman trapped in a gilded cage of financial abuse. Taking a deep breath, I pulled out my phone and dialed Olivia's number. It was time to fight back. Olivia answered on the second ring, her voice groggy with sleep. Rachel, it's almost midnight. What's wrong? The concern in her voice nearly broke my composure, but I forced myself to remain calm as I switched to speakerphone and began moving through the house, checking for any devices Dan might have planted. I need your help, Liv. Dan isn't who we thought he was. I need you to listen carefully, and I need you to not ask questions until I'm finished. My voice shook slightly as I pulled open drawers and checked behind picture frames. The weight of Dan's betrayal pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. As I recounted the events at Canlis, Olivia remained silent, but I could hear her shuffling papers, likely already taking notes. When I finished, The silence stretched for a moment before she spoke, her voice sharp with controlled anger. "I'm coming to get you. Pack a bag. We need to document everything before he can cover his tracks." "No," I said firmly, pulling down the heavy curtains to peer out into the darkness. A car was parked across the street, its occupant barely visible in the dim streetlight. "He has someone watching the house. If you show up now, he'll know something's wrong. I have until 9 a.m. tomorrow. I need legal advice, not a rescue mission." I heard Olivia take a deep breath, switching into lawyer mode. "Okay, first things first. Is your phone secure? Do you have reason to believe he's monitoring your calls or messages?" My hands froze on the vintage secretary desk where my grandmother used to write her letters. Dan had insisted on setting up my new phone when we got married, claiming it was an anniversary gift. "No, I don't think this line is secure. Let me check something." Moving to my grandmother's bedroom, I pulled up the loose floorboard under her antique Persian rug. Inside was a small lockbox, my emergency kit, she'd called it. Among the documents and cash was an old flip phone, one I'd forgotten about until this moment. "Liv, I'm going to hang up and call you back from a different number. Give me 5 minutes." After switching phones, I walked the perimeter of the house again, this time noticing details I'd missed in my initial panic. The back garden motion. Sensor lights had been adjusted, likely to monitor any escape attempts. The side gate that had always squeaked now moved silently. Someone had oiled it recently. Dan's preparations went beyond just legal documents. "The house is being watched," I told Olivia when I called back. "And I think it's been prepared for this. He's had people here, making small changes." "Listen carefully." Olivia's voice was steady, grounding. "You need evidence of coercion. Wisconsin is a one-party consent state for recordings. Start documenting everything. Take photos of any marks he left on your wrist. Write down everything that happened tonight while it's fresh. Forward any threatening text to this phone if you can. We need to build a case." Moving through my grandmother's study, I began pulling out her old legal files. "He knows about the trust fund, Liv. He's been planning this since before we got married. Everything. The whole relationship. It was all a lie." "Focus, Rachel. We can deal with the emotional fallout later. Right now, we need to protect you and your assets. Tell me about the trust fund. What exactly are the conditions?" I pulled out the trust documents, scanning them quickly. Grandmother set it up so that I can only access it if I maintain ownership of the house. It was her way of ensuring I'd always have financial independence. But there's something else. My voice trailed off as I noticed a sealed envelope tucked into the documents, my name written in my grandmother's elegant handwriting. "What is it?" Olivia prompted. "She left me a letter. I never noticed it before." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope, unfolding the pages within. As I read, tears began to fall freely down my cheeks. "My dearest Rachel," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means you've found yourself in a situation where someone is trying to take your independence. I've seen too many women lose everything to men who claim to love them. That's why I set up the trust the way I did. But there's more to protect you." I read the next lines aloud to Olivia. "The house deed has a special clause. Any transfer of ownership must be approved by the trust administrator, who isn't just any lawyer. It's Judge Patricia Morgan." Olivia's sharp intake of breath echoed through the phone. Judge Morgan was known for her fierce advocacy for women's rights and her zero-tolerance policy for financial abuse. "Your grandmother was brilliant," Olivia said softly. "Even if you signed those papers tomorrow, they wouldn't be valid without Judge Morgan's approval." A wave of relief washed over me, quickly followed by fresh fear. "But Dan doesn't know that. When he finds out..." I couldn't finish the sentence. "Which is exactly why we need to move quickly." Olivia's voice was firm. "Listen carefully. Here's what we're going to do." Over the next hour, we formulated a plan. While I documented everything from the evening, Olivia made calls to her contacts in the legal community. Judge Morgan was out of the country, but her clerk agreed to come in early the next morning after hearing the situation. As I moved through the house gathering evidence, I discovered more signs of Dan's preparation. A small camera hidden in a bookshelf. A GPS tracker attached to my car. Each discovery made me feel more violated, but also more determined. "The photos he showed you at dinner," Olivia mused. "The ones of you with clients. We need copies. Can you access his cloud storage?" I sat down at my grandmother's computer, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "He uses the same password for everything. He thinks I don't know it, but I've seen him enter it enough times." Logging into his account, I found not just the photos he'd shown me, but hundreds more. Evidence of surveillance going back months. "Download everything," Olivia instructed. And Rachel. "There's something else we need to discuss. The timing of all this. The anniversary dinner. The lawyer waiting at the restaurant. The surveillance. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. He's been planning this for a long time. Which means there might be more we don't know about." I finished her thought, feeling sick. "I need to check our finances." Logging into our joint accounts, I found what I feared. Large transfers to offshore accounts, all carefully hidden, under legitimate-looking business expenses. Dan hadn't just been planning to take my house. He'd been systematically draining our joint accounts. "Liv," my voice cracked, "he's taken almost everything. The money I made from my real estate sales, my savings, it's all gone." "That's actually good news," Olivia said, surprising me. "It gives us evidence of financial abuse. Keep documenting everything. I'm going to wake up Judge Morgan's clerk again. This is bigger than we thought." A noise outside made me freeze. Through the window, I could see the car across the street starting its engine. "Someone's moving," I whispered into the phone. "Stay calm. What time is it?" I glanced at the clock, 3:47 a.m. They're probably changing shifts. Dan would have multiple people watching the house. Good. Use this time to gather what you need. Essential documents, irreplaceable items. Pack a bag, but don't take it with you to the meeting tomorrow. I'll have someone retrieve it later. As I moved through the house, selecting what to take, my grandmother's letter crinkled in my pocket. There was a postscript I hadn't read to. "Olivia, remember, my dear, the strongest walls aren't the ones that never crack, but the ones that know how to bend without breaking. Sometimes survival means playing along until you can fight back on your own terms." The rest of the night passed in a blur of activity. I photographed documents, downloaded files, and packed essential items into a small bag that I hid in my grandmother's secret attic space. Throughout it all, I kept thinking about the signs I'd missed. The way Dan had slowly isolated me from friends, his insistence on handling all our finances, the subtle put-downs that had chipped away at my confidence. Around 6 a.m., Olivia called back on the secure line. "Everything's in place. Judge Morgan's clerk will be at the lawyer's office at 8:30. She's bringing a court order to freeze all assets and launch an investigation. But Rachel, you need to be prepared. When Dan realizes his plan is falling apart, he might become dangerous." I looked out at the brightening sky, watching as early morning joggers began to appear on the street. The car watching the house had changed again. Now it was a dark SUV with tinted windows. "I know, but I'm done being afraid. He took advantage of my trust, tried to steal my inheritance, and thought he could threaten me into submission. He has no idea who he's dealing with." "Just be careful," Olivia cautioned. "We have everything we need legally. Don't antagonize him." As I prepared to face the day, I took one last walk through my grandmother's house, my house. Every room held memories, not just of my childhood, but of generations of strong women who had lived here. In the master bedroom, I opened my grandmother's jewelry box and removed her favorite pearl necklace. She had worn it to court every day during her career as a prosecutor. "For courage," she used to say. Fastening it around my neck, I looked at myself in the mirror. The frightened woman from last night was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone ready to fight back. Dan had spent a year planning to destroy me, but he'd underestimated 3 things: my grandmother's foresight, my best friend's loyalty, and my own strength. My phone buzzed with a text from Dan. "Good morning, darling. Don't forget our appointment. I'm sending a car to pick you up at 8:30. Wear something appropriate for signing important documents." I texted back a simple, "Okay," while touching the pearls at my neck. In less than 3 hours, Dan's carefully constructed plan would crumble. But first, I had to play my part perfectly. Survival meant being smarter, not just stronger. Looking around my bedroom one last time, I spotted a small photo I'd missed in my night of evidence gathering. It was from my wedding day, Dan and I dancing, looking blissfully happy. The woman in that photo had no idea what was coming, but she had unknowingly married her own worst enemy. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the biggest battles are fought with documents and evidence rather than weapons and words. The sound of a car pulling up outside pulled me from my thoughts. Right on time, Dan's watchdog arriving to escort me to what he thought would be his moment of triumph. I smoothed my blazer, checked my subtle makeup one last time, and picked up my briefcase containing copies of all the evidence we'd gathered. "Game on, Dan! Let's see who really knows how to play the long game." The black SUV glided through Seattle's morning traffic, its tinted windows sealing me in artificial darkness. The driver, one of Dan's associates I'd never met, hadn't spoken a word since I'd gotten in. His silence felt orchestrated, another piece of Dan's psychological warfare. I clutched my briefcase closer, feeling the weight of the documents inside. My grandmother's pearls pressed against my throat with each breath, a constant reminder of why I was fighting. Downtown Seattle emerged through the morning mist, glass towers reaching toward a pearl gray sky. The law offices of Henderson and Associates occupied the 23rd floor of a sleek high-rise, its marble lobby echoing with the click of my heels as I followed the driver to the elevator. My phone buzzed, a message from Olivia. "Everything's in place. Judge Morgan's clerk arrived early. Stay strong." The elevator doors opened directly into the law firm's reception area, where Dan was already waiting. He looked immaculate in a charcoal suit, every hair perfectly in place. "Darling," he said, stepping forward to kiss my cheek. His cologne, the expensive one I'd given him for Christmas, made my stomach turn. "I trust you had time to say your goodbyes?" Before I could respond, a door opened and Mr. Henderson himself emerged. I recognized him from Dan's firm's social events, a silver-haired man with cold eyes and a practiced smile. "Mrs. Matthews, how lovely to see you again. Shall we proceed? Everyone's waiting in the conference room." Everyone? I hadn't expected an audience. Dan's hand found the small of my back, guiding me forward with gentle pressure that felt more like a push. The conference room was dominated by a massive mahogany table, around which sat several people I didn't recognize. But my eyes immediately found the one person I was looking for, a young woman in a navy suit who I knew must be Judge Morgan's clerk. "Rachel, you remember James Peterson, our family lawyer," Dan said smoothly, indicating a man I'd met briefly at our wedding. "And this is Sarah Chen from the bank, Robert Thorne from the title company, and—" He paused, frowning slightly, at the unfamiliar face. "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met." "Amanda Walsh," the young woman in navy said crisply, standing to shake my hand. "I'm here representing Judge Patricia Morgan's office." I felt Dan's hand tense against my back. "Judge Morgan?" His voice remained pleasant, but I could hear the undertone of confusion. I wasn't aware her office needed to be involved in a simple property transfer between spouses. Amanda smiled, the expression professional but unyielding. "Judge Morgan is the appointed administrator of the Wilson Family Trust. Any transfer of property held within the trust requires her approval." She began pulling documents from her briefcase. "In fact, I have some concerns about the proposed transfer that need to be addressed before we proceed." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dan's hand fell away from my back as he turned to Mr. Henderson. This is the first I'm hearing about any trust administrator requirements. Perhaps we should take a brief recess to review the documentation? Of course, Henderson began, but Amanda cut him off. Actually, I believe it would be more productive to address these concerns immediately. Mrs. Matthews, would you please confirm whether you're signing these documents of your own free will? Dan laughed, the sound brittle. Of course she is. Rachel, darling, tell them this is what you want. I looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes before finally settling on Dan's. In them, I saw the first flicker of uncertainty. No, I said clearly. I'm not signing anything. The silence that followed was deafening. Dan's facade cracked for just a moment, showing the rage beneath. Rachel, we discussed this. Don't be difficult. Did you discuss it before or after you threatened to destroy her career with fabricated evidence? Amanda asked, placing a folder on the table. We have copies of the surveillance photos you used to coerce Mrs. Matthews, as well as records of unauthorized transfers from joint accounts to offshore holdings. Dan's face went pale. Those are private financial matters between my wife and me. You have no right. Actually, we have every right, another voice said from the doorway. Olivia stood there, flanked by 2 police officers. Financial coercion is a form of domestic abuse, Dan, and we have enough evidence to prove you've been planning this for months. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Dan lunged for the documents on the table, but one of the officers moved faster, catching his arm. Daniel Matthews, you're under arrest for domestic abuse, attempted fraud, and financial exploitation. As the officers read Dan his rights, his mask finally shattered completely. You stupid bitch, he snarled at me. You have no idea what you've done. I owned you. Everything was perfect until you ruined it. I stood up, my legs steadier than I expected. No, Dan. You never owned me. You just made the mistake of thinking you could. Mr. Henderson and the other professionals sat frozen, watching as Dan was led away in handcuffs. Only Sarah Chen from the bank seemed unsurprised, already, pulling out additional documents. Mrs. Matthews, we'll need to go through your accounts immediately. We've already frozen the suspicious transfers, but there may be more we need to trace. The next few hours passed in a blur of statements and signatures, real ones this time, not the forced ones Dan had planned. Olivia stayed by my side, her legal expertise helping me navigate the complex process of undoing Dan's financial web. By late afternoon, we had a clearer picture of what he'd done and how close he'd come to succeeding. He's been siphoning money for months, Sarah explained, pointing to a complex series of transactions. Small amounts at first, then larger transfers disguised as investment opportunities. We've already identified accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. The surveillance operation wasn't cheap either, Olivia added, reviewing the evidence. He hired private investigators, had your phone cloned, even paid off building staff to report your movements. This was elaborate, Rachel. He must have been planning it since before you got married. The realization that my entire marriage had been a long con designed to steal my inheritance should have devastated me. Instead, I felt an odd sense of clarity. He didn't count on my grandmother's foresight, I said, touching the pearls at my neck. Or on having good friends. Amanda Walsh, who had stayed to help coordinate with the financial investigators, looked up from her notes. Judge Morgan wanted me to tell you she's cutting her vacation short to handle this personally. She was friends with your grandmother. She said to tell you Eleanor would be proud. Tears pricked at my eyes for the first time that day. My grandmother, even from beyond the grave, had known what I might face and had put protections in place. The house wasn't just a piece of property, it was a fortress she'd built to protect me. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the conference room windows, I finally felt exhaustion settling in. Olivia noticed immediately. "That's enough for today," she announced. "The police have secured your house, and the restraining order is in place. You need rest." But I wasn't ready to go home yet. "Can we stop somewhere first?" Olivia drove us to Cary Park, where the city spread out below us like a carpet of lights. The Space Needle glowed against the darkening sky, the same view I'd seen from Canlis the night before. But everything was different now. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," I said quietly. "The way he love-bombed me at first, then slowly started controlling everything. How did I not see it?" "Because he was good at what he did," Olivia replied. "These types always are. But you did see it, Rachel. You saw it when it mattered most, and you fought back." My phone had been ringing all day with calls from shocked friends and family as news of Dan's arrest spread. I'd let them all go to voicemail, not ready to tell the story yet. But there was one call I needed to make. The phone rang twice before Marcus, my colleague from the real estate office, answered. "Rachel, are you okay? There are rumors flying around the office." "I'm okay," I said, surprising myself by actually meaning it. "But I need a favor. Those clients Dan claimed I was having inappropriate relationships with. Can you help me reach out to them? They should know they were being photographed without their consent." Marcus's response was immediate. "Of course. The whole office is behind you, Rachel. Take whatever time you need." As Olivia drove me home, I thought about all the women who might be trapped in similar situations. Golden cages built by men who claimed to love them while plotting to take everything. My grandmother had been right. The house wasn't just a safety net for me. It was a symbol of independence that Dan had tried and failed to take away. The Victorian stood silhouetted against the night sky, its windows glowing warmly. Police had already swept it for surveillance devices, removing every trace of Dan's intrusion. As I climbed the familiar steps, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just my inheritance anymore. It was my battleground, and I had won. Inside, everything looked exactly as I'd left it, but nothing felt the same. I walked through each room, turning on lights, reclaiming my space. In my grandmother's study, my study now, I found her letter again and read the final lines I hadn't noticed before. "Remember, Rachel, that strength isn't just about fighting back. It's about rebuilding, about turning pain into purpose. You come from a long line of women who refuse to be owned. Honor that legacy not just by surviving, but by helping others survive too." Sitting at her desk, I opened my laptop and began to write. My story needed to be told, not just for me, but for every woman facing her own Dan, wondering if she's crazy for seeing cracks in the perfect facade. By morning, I had the outline of something bigger than a simple account of financial abuse. It was a roadmap for recognition, resistance, and recovery. Olivia found me there when she came to check on me, still typing as dawn broke over Seattle. "You should sleep," she said gently. I shook my head. "Not yet. I need to finish this while it's clear in my mind. Other women need to know they're not alone." She read over my shoulder for a moment, then pulled up a chair. "Okay, but let me help. We'll make it a guide. Legal resources, warning signs, escape strategies." As we worked, I realized that Dan had given me something he never intended: a purpose. He'd tried to take my inheritance, my independence, my very identity. Instead, he'd helped me find my voice and a mission that went beyond just surviving his betrayal. The Victorian house creaked and settled around us, its walls holding decades of stories. My grandmother's, mine, and now, potentially, the stories of other women who needed to know they weren't alone. Dan had seen it as just a property to be acquired. He'd never understood that some things can't be bought, sold, or stolen. They can only be protected, preserved, and passed on to those who need them most. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of my grandmother's study, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the antique desk where I'd spent the night writing. My coffee had long since gone cold, but the words kept flowing. Every revelation about Dan's elaborate scheme unleashed another memory that needed to be examined, documented, and transformed into something useful for others. A gentle knock at the door broke my concentration. Judge Patricia Morgan stood in the doorway, her silver hair gleaming in the morning light. She'd flown back early from her vacation in Europe, arriving straight from the airport to see me. Your grandmother would be sitting exactly where you are now, working through the night when she had a particularly challenging case, she said, setting her briefcase down. The judge's presence filled the room with quiet authority. She'd been my grandmother's closest friend and confidant for over 40 years, yet this was the first time I'd seen her since the funeral. I should have come to you sooner, she said, taking a seat across from me. When I heard Daniel Matthews' name connected to your marriage, something felt wrong. His firm has a reputation for orchestrating complex financial schemes, but we could never prove anything. My fingers traced the edges of my laptop where I'd spent hours documenting everything. He almost succeeded, if grandmother hadn't put those protections in place. Eleanor was brilliant that way, Judge Morgan interrupted, pulling out a thick folder. She didn't just protect you, she created a template. Every property transfer involving trust assets now requires administrative review. You're not the first woman Daniel Matthews has targeted, but you'll be the last. The implications of her words sank in slowly. There were others? Judge Morgan nodded grimly. 3 that we know of. All wealthy women, all with significant property holdings. He'd marry them, spend months building their trust while secretly documenting their every move, then orchestrate a crisis that forced them to sign over their assets. By the time they realized what had happened, the money was gone. My stomach churned. Why didn't anyone stop him? The same reason most predators get away with it: shame, fear, isolation. His previous wives were too embarrassed to press charges. He'd threatened to release compromising photos, destroy their reputations. They just wanted to disappear and forget it ever happened. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. But you fought back, Rachel. You've given us everything we need to not just stop him, but to change how these cases are handled. A knock at the front door interrupted us. Olivia entered moments later with Sarah Chen from the bank, both carrying stacks of documents. The forensic accountants have traced most of the missing money, Sarah announced, spreading papers across the desk. He had a pattern: small transfers at first, then larger ones disguised as investment opportunities. We've found similar patterns in accounts connected to his previous marriages. Judge Morgan examined the financial records with practiced eyes. Classic gaslighting combined with financial abuse. He'd make his wives doubt their own judgment while systematically stripping away their resources. By the time he made his final move, they were too financially and emotionally dependent to resist. Olivia pulled up a chair, adding her own files to the growing collection. The district attorney wants to move quickly on this. With Rachel's evidence and the financial records, we can charge him with multiple counts of fraud, domestic abuse, and criminal coercion. But there's something else. She hesitated, glancing at me before continuing. 2 of his previous wives have come forward after hearing about his arrest. They want to testify. The weight of this news settled over the room. These women, who had lost everything to Dan's manipulation, were willing to break their silence. Because I had fought back, they found the courage to speak up too. Judge Morgan's phone buzzed, another message from her clerk. The DA's office has frozen all of Dan's assets. The preliminary hearing is set for next week. Rachel, are you ready? To tell your story in court? Was I ready? The question echoed in my mind as I looked around my grandmother's study. Every surface held memories of her strength, her determination to protect not just me, but other women who might face similar battles. Yes, I said firmly. But I want to do more than just testify. I want to use what happened to help others recognize the signs before it's too late. Olivia pulled out her laptop. I've been thinking about that. Your grandmother's legal legacy combined with your experience. We could create a foundation. Provide legal support, financial education, safe housing for women trying to escape similar situations. Sarah Chen nodded enthusiastically. The bank would be interested in partnering with something like that. We've seen an increase in financial abuse cases, but most women don't know their rights or where to turn for help. As they discussed possibilities, I found myself drawn to the window seat where my grandmother used to sit, watching the city below while working on her most challenging cases. The morning sun had burned away the fog, revealing a clear view of Elliott Bay. Somewhere out there, Dan sat in a cell, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. He'd thought he could take everything from me, but instead, he'd given me a mission. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. More women came forward, not just Dan's previous wives, but others who recognized their own situations. In the news coverage of his arrest, each story followed a similar pattern: love bombing, isolation, gradual control of finances, and finally, coerced property transfers. We converted my grandmother's formal dining room into a makeshift office, with Olivia coordinating legal support while I worked with Sarah to develop financial literacy workshops. Judge Morgan connected us with advocacy groups, domestic violence shelters, and other organizations that could help build a comprehensive support network. The Victorian house that Dan had tried to steal became a symbol of resistance and recovery. Women would arrive nervous and uncertain, clutching papers or phones containing evidence of their own dangerous situations. They'd leave with action plans, legal referrals, and most importantly, the knowledge that they weren't alone. One afternoon, as I was reviewing potential foundation names with Olivia, an elegant woman in her 60s asked to see me. She introduced herself as Catherine Pierce, Dan's first wife. "I saw your story on the news," she said, settling into one of the study's leather chairs. "I've spent 15 years trying to forget what he did to me, but watching you fight back, it woke something up inside me." Catherine's story spilled out, a familiar pattern of manipulation and control, but with a devastating twist. "He didn't just take my property," she explained, her hands twisting in her lap. "He took my belief in myself, made me think I was crazy for suspecting him, that I was too unstable to manage my own affairs. By the time he finished, I doubted every decision I'd ever made." Her words struck a chord. How many other women had their confidence systematically destroyed by men like Dan? How many still carried the scars of that psychological warfare? "We're building something here," I told her, sharing our plans for the foundation. "Would you consider being part of it? Your experience could help others recognize the warning signs earlier." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I'd like that. Maybe it's time to turn all those years of pain into something positive." As she left, I remembered something my grandmother once told me. "The strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire." Dan had tried to break me, just as he'd broken others before me. Instead, he'd helped create a network of survivors, each one determined to prevent other women from falling into the same trap. The day before the preliminary hearing, Judge Morgan called an unexpected meeting. She arrived with Amanda Walsh and 2 other women I recognized from the news coverage of Dan's arrest, his second and third wives. We gathered in the study, an unlikely sisterhood bound by a common enemy. "The DA's office has offered a plea deal," Judge Morgan announced. 20 years, no possibility of early release, plus full restitution to all victims. They want to avoid a lengthy trial that would force you all to relive your trauma publicly. The room fell silent as we absorbed this information. 20 years seemed both too much and not enough for the lives he'd damaged. Linda, his second wife, spoke first. "I don't care about the money. I just want him to never be able to do this to anyone else. The plea deal would include permanent restrictions on his ability to work in finance or handle other people's assets, Amanda added. Plus, the case will set a precedent for how similar financial abuse cases are handled in the future. I thought about all the women who had come forward in the past week, each one carrying their own story of betrayal and survival. We should take it, I said finally, but with conditions. I want the settlement to include funding for the foundation. Not just money, but a requirement that all firms handling trust assets implement protective measures like the ones my grandmother created. Judge Morgan smiled, the same smile I remembered from childhood visits when she and my grandmother would discuss particularly satisfying legal victories. I think we can arrange that. Eleanor would be proud of how you're carrying on her work. That evening, after everyone had left, I walked through the house that had become so much more than just my inheritance. Each room now held new memories of women finding their voice, of survivors becoming advocates, of pain transformed into purpose. Dan had seen this house as just another asset to acquire. He'd never understood that its true value lay not in its walls, but in its potential to shelter and strengthen others. Standing in the garden where my grandmother had taught me to tend her beloved roses, I felt her presence more strongly than ever. She hadn't just left me a house, she'd left me a mission. Dan had unknowingly played right into her plans, giving me the experience and motivation to carry her work forward. Tomorrow, I would face him in court one last time. Not as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. He'd thought he was writing the end of my story, but instead, he'd only written the beginning. The rest would be written not just by me, but by every woman who found her way to this house, seeking shelter in its strength and leaving with the power to reclaim their own. The setting sun painted the Victorian's windows in shades of gold and rose, a reminder that even the darkest days eventually give way to light. Somewhere in the city, other women were facing their own battles with men like Dan, but now, thanks to a grandmother's foresight and a granddaughter's defiance, they wouldn't have to face those battles alone. The foundation we were building would be their beacon, their fortress, their proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding the fall, but from learning to rise again, stronger and wiser than before. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone facade gleaming in the early morning light. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like metal flowers. I hadn't expected this level of media attention, but Dan's case had struck a nerve, exposing a pattern of financial abuse that resonated with too many women. Judge Morgan walked beside me, her presence keeping the reporters at bay. Behind us, Olivia carried a briefcase containing the evidence we'd gathered. Financial records, surveillance photos, threatening messages. Each piece told part of a larger story of systematic manipulation and control. Inside the courthouse, we found Catherine, Linda, and Marie, Dan's previous wives, already waiting. They'd arrived early to avoid the media circus, each woman carrying her own stack of documents detailing his crimes against them. We'd spent hours preparing our testimonies, weaving together a pattern of behavior that spanned more than 15 years. Mrs. Matthews? A court officer appeared. They're ready for you. The courtroom felt smaller than I'd imagined, more intimate. Dan sat at the defense table, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his usual tailored suits. When our eyes met, he attempted his old charming smile, but it faltered when I didn't look away. The power dynamic had shifted, and we both knew it. District Attorney Elena Rodriguez began her opening statement, her voice clear and steady. Your Honor, the state will prove that Daniel Matthews engaged in a systematic pattern of domestic abuse and financial exploitation, targeting wealthy women through marriage and using sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation to gain control of their assets. As she spoke, I watched the jury's faces. There were nods of recognition, particularly from the women, as she outlined Dan's methodology, the whirlwind romance, the gradual isolation, the subtle undermining of confidence, And finally, the coerced property transfers. Dan's attorney tried to paint him as a misunderstood businessman, suggesting that his wives had willingly signed over their assets as part of normal marital financial planning. But the evidence told a different story. Bank records showed the systematic draining of accounts. Surveillance photos revealed the extent of his stalking. Email threads exposed his network of private investigators and compromised employees. When it was my turn to testify, I felt surprisingly calm. Dan had taken away my fear along with everything else he'd tried to steal. "The night of our anniversary," I began, "my husband tried to force me to sign over my grandmother's house. Not just the property, but the trust fund attached to it." When I hesitated, he showed me surveillance photos, threatening to destroy my career if I didn't comply. I detailed everything: the elaborate dinner setup, the waiting lawyer, the threats veiled as concern. With each word, I watched Dan's facade crack further. He hadn't expected this level of detail, hadn't thought I'd remember every manipulation, every careful phrase designed to make me doubt myself. Catherine testified next, her voice growing stronger as she described how Dan had systematically stripped away her assets and her self-confidence. "He made me believe I was incapable of managing my own money," she said. By the time he finished, I doubted every decision I'd ever made. Linda and Marie followed, each story adding another layer to the picture of Dan's calculated predation. The jury listened intently as the pattern emerged, how he'd refined his techniques with each marriage, becoming more sophisticated in his manipulation. During a brief recess, Judge Morgan pulled me aside. "The jury's reaction is strong," she said quietly. "Watch Dan's attorney. He knows they're losing." Sure enough, when court resumed, Dan's lawyer approached the bench requesting a brief consultation with his client. 20 minutes later, they returned with a change of plea. "Your Honor," Dan's attorney announced, "my client wishes to accept the state's plea offer." The courtroom fell silent. Dan stood, his arrogance finally cracking as he faced the consequences of his actions. "I plead guilty to all charges," he said, his voice barely audible. Judge Morgan's voice rang out clear and firm as she accepted the plea and outlined the terms: 20 years in prison, no possibility of early release, full restitution to all victims, and permanent restrictions on his ability to work in finance or handle others' assets. But it was the additional conditions we'd negotiated that felt like the real victory. Dan's assets would be liquidated to create a foundation dedicated to preventing financial abuse. Every firm handling trust assets in the state would be required to implement protective measures similar to those my grandmother had created. As the bailiff led Dan away, he turned to look at me one last time. I saw confusion in his eyes. He still couldn't understand how his perfect plan had unraveled. He'd chosen me because I seemed like an easy target, never realizing that my grandmother had prepared me for men like him long before we met. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Catherine, Linda, Marie, and I stood together, a united front of survivors. District Attorney Rodriguez spoke first, outlining how the case would change how financial abuse cases were handled. Then, surprising everyone, Catherine stepped forward. "For 15 years, I believed I was alone," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "I thought I was the only one who had fallen for Daniel Matthews' manipulation. Today, we're sending a message to other women in similar situations. You're not alone, and you don't have to stay silent." Back at the Victorian, we gathered in my grandmother's study, no longer just survivors, but advocates. The foundation was taking shape, with Catherine offering to lead support groups, Linda developing financial literacy programs, and Marie working with Olivia on legal education initiatives. Sarah Chen arrived with news from the bank. "We've identified 3 more cases with similar patterns," she said, spreading files across the desk. "Different perpetrators, but the same methodology. Your case has given these women the courage to come forward." Judge Morgan nodded approvingly. This is exactly what Eleanor hoped for when she set up those trust protections. One case creating a ripple effect of change. As evening fell, I found myself alone in the garden, my grandmother's favorite thinking spot. The roses she'd planted were blooming, their scent filling the air with memories of summer afternoons spent learning about more than just gardening. She'd taught me about resilience, about the importance of having roots strong enough to weather any storm. Dan had seen me as a target, never realizing he was walking into a trap set by a brilliant woman who'd spent her life protecting others. My grandmother had known that someday, someone might try to take everything from me. Instead of just building walls to keep predators out, she'd created a system that would expose them, using their own greed against them. The foundation's first official meeting was scheduled for tomorrow. Women from across the state had already reached out, seeking help or offering support. The Victorian house would become a sanctuary, not just for me, but for anyone needing to rebuild their lives after financial abuse. My phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. Another woman had come forward, this one with evidence linking one of Dan's former colleagues to a similar scheme. The work was just beginning, but now we had a blueprint for fighting back. Standing in the garden where my grandmother had taught me about strength and survival, I finally understood the full scope of her legacy. She hadn't just protected me. She'd given me the tools to protect others. Dan had tried to steal my inheritance, never realizing that its true value lay not in property or money, but in the power to create change. The roses caught the last rays of sunlight, their petals glowing like embers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories of women fighting to reclaim their lives from men like Dan. But tonight, in this garden where my grandmother had planted both flowers and wisdom, I felt only gratitude. She had known that sometimes the best way to fight darkness is to create light, to transform pain into purpose, to build something stronger than the forces trying to tear us down. Dan had thought he was writing the end of my story, but he'd only written the beginning of something much bigger than himself. The Victorian house stood sentinel in the gathering dusk, its windows glowing with welcome. Inside, files waited to be reviewed, stories waited to be heard, lives waited to be rebuilt. But out here, among the roses my grandmother had planted, with such care, I felt her presence in every bloom. "Plant your roots deep," she used to say, "and no storm can uproot you." Dan had been a storm, but he'd only made my roots grow deeper, stronger, more determined to help others weather similar tempests. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in this garden where generations of strong women had found their courage, I was exactly where I needed to be. The foundation we were building would be more than just a support system. It would be a testament to the power of women protecting women, of turning personal pain into collective strength. The roses nodded in the evening breeze, their fragrance, a reminder that even after the harshest winter, beauty finds a way to bloom again. Dan had tried to take everything from me, but instead, he'd given me a purpose greater than anything he could have imagined. As darkness fell, I made my way back inside, passing through rooms that would soon be filled with women reclaiming their power, their voices, their futures. The Victorian house had become more than just a home. It was a beacon of hope, a fortress of strength, a place where survivors became advocates. And somewhere in the city, other women were facing their own battles with men like Dan. But now, thanks to a grandmother's foresight and a granddaughter's defiance, they wouldn't have to face those battles alone. The foundation we were building would be their guide, their shelter, their proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding the fall, but from learning to rise again, stronger and wiser than before. Tomorrow would bring new stories, new challenges, new opportunities to create change. But tonight, in this house that had become so much more than just an inheritance, I felt only peace. Dan had tried to write my story, but he'd failed to understand one crucial truth. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we write ourselves, not alone, but together with others who understand our struggles and share our determination. to create change. The evening settled around the Victorian like a protective embrace, its shadows holding not threats, but possibilities. In the quiet of my grandmother's study, surrounded by the tools of transformation, I began to write the next chapter. Not just for myself, but for every woman who would find her way to this sanctuary, seeking shelter in its strength and leaving, with the power to reclaim her own story. Dawn broke over Seattle, casting long shadows through the Victorian stained glass windows as I prepared for our foundation's first official meeting. The dining room had been transformed into a conference space, its antique table now covered with folders containing resources, legal documents, and educational materials. Each chair held a story waiting to be told, a life waiting to be rebuilt. Olivia arrived early, carrying fresh coffee and pastries from Pike Place Market. The aroma filled the house, mixing with the lingering scent of my grandmother's lavender sachets. "The media's already gathering outside," she said, setting up her laptop. "Word's gotten out about what we're doing here." Sarah Chen from the I. Bank followed shortly after, bringing financial literacy workbooks she'd developed specifically for survivors of economic abuse. "These women need more than just legal help," she explained, spreading the materials across the table. "They need to understand how to regain control of their financial lives." Catherine Pierce arrived next, her silver hair elegantly styled, carrying a stack of journals. I started writing down everything I remembered about Dan's manipulation. "Techniques," she explained. "Patterns I didn't see at the time but are so clear now. Maybe they can help others recognize the signs earlier." As more women began arriving, the Victorian seemed to come alive with purpose. Each room held small groups engaged in different aspects of recovery and rebuilding. In the library, Linda led a workshop on recognizing financial red flags. The sunroom became a space for support group meetings, while the study hosted one-on-one consultations with legal advisors. A young woman named Jessica sat across from me, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "My husband hasn't done anything as extreme as Dan," she said quietly. "But reading about your case, the way he controls our money, checks every receipt, questions every purchase, I'm starting to see things differently." Judge Morgan, who had stopped by between court sessions, overheard Jessica's words. "Financial abuse often starts subtly," she explained, joining us. "It's like water wearing away at stone, barely noticeable. At first, but eventually, it can erode everything." Throughout the morning, more stories emerged. A successful restaurateur whose husband had secretly mortgaged her business. A teacher whose partner had opened credit cards in her name, maxing them out and destroying her credit score. A retired nurse whose life savings had vanished into her new husband's investment opportunities. Each story was unique, yet followed familiar patterns, the gradual isolation from friends and family, the subtle undermining of confidence, the careful grooming that made financial abuse seem like love and protection rather than control. Marie, Dan's third wife, led a session on rebuilding self-trust after financial trauma. "The hardest part isn't just recovering the money," she explained to the group. "It's learning to trust your own judgment again. These men don't just steal our assets, they steal our confidence in ourselves." In the kitchen, during a brief lunch break, Sarah shared news from her banking colleagues. "Other institutions are interested in implementing similar protective measures," she said, spreading out proposals. "Your grandmother's trust requirements could become standard practice across the industry." The afternoon brought more visitors: domestic violence advocates, financial advisors, legal professionals. Each offered expertise, resources, and most importantly, understanding. The Victorian buzzed with energy, its rooms filled with women supporting women, strength building upon strength. A reporter from the Seattle Times arrived, hoping to document our work. She sat quietly in different sessions, taking notes, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes. "I had no idea financial abuse was so common," she whispered to me during a break. "Or so devastating." As the day progressed, we began organizing our resources into a comprehensive program. Legal protection came first, helping women document abuse, understand their rights, and navigate the court system. Financial education followed, teaching everything from basic budgeting to complex asset protection. But perhaps most importantly, we created spaces for healing, groups where women could share their stories without judgment, where survival strategies could be passed from one generation to the next, where isolation gave way to community. Late in the afternoon, an elderly woman arrived, leaning heavily on a cane. She introduced herself as Margaret, a retired judge who had worked with my grandmother decades ago. "Eleanor and I saw so many women lose everything to manipulative partners," she said, settling into a chair in the study. "We tried to change laws, create protections, but the system was stacked against us. What you're doing here, this is what we dreamed of." Margaret shared stories of cases from the past, women who had lost homes, businesses, retirement savings to partners who had earned their trust only to betray it. "The tactics haven't changed much," she observed. "Only now we have better tools to fight back." As evening approached, smaller groups formed naturally, women exchanging phone numbers and making plans to support each other outside our formal programs. In the garden, I found Catherine and Linda sitting among the roses, sharing strategies for healing from their experiences with Dan. "I spent years thinking I was alone," Catherine said, touching a blooming rose gently. "Thinking I was the only one who had fallen for his manipulation. Now look at us, turning our pain into power, helping others avoid the same traps." The setting sun painted the Victorian's windows in shades of amber and rose, casting warm light over groups of women, still deep in conversation. Some were crying, others laughing, all connecting over shared experiences and determination to create change. Olivia found me in my grandmother's study, reviewing notes from the day. "This is bigger than we imagined," she said, sinking into a chair. "We're going to need more space, more resources." Judge Morgan, who had returned for the evening session, joined us. "I think I can help with that," she said, pulling out her phone. "Several colleagues have expressed interest in supporting similar programs in their jurisdictions. Your grandmother's model could be replicated across the state." As the last visitors left, their arms full of resources and hearts full of hope, I walked through the Victorians' quiet rooms. Each space held echoes of the day's conversations. Women finding their voices, sharing their strength, building networks of support that would extend far beyond these walls. In the garden, where my grandmother had taught me about resilience, I found a small notebook someone had left behind. Inside, a message was written in careful handwriting. "Thank you for showing me I'm not alone. Today is the first day I've felt strong enough to leave him." The Victorian stood sentinel in the gathering dusk, its windows glowing with welcome. Inside, plans were already forming for tomorrow's sessions, next week's workshops, next month's expansion. But out here, among the roses my grandmother had planted with such care, I felt the full weight of what we were building. This wasn't just about protecting assets or preventing fraud. It was about creating a space where women could reclaim their power, where survival stories could inspire others to break free, where financial independence became a tool for personal liberation. Dan had tried to steal my inheritance, never realizing that its true value lay not in property or money, but in its potential to help others. My grandmother had known this, had planned for it, had created a foundation upon which something larger could be built. As night fell over Seattle, I made my way back inside, passing through rooms that would soon be filled again with women seeking help and finding strength. The Victorian had become more than just a home or a headquarters. It was a beacon of hope, a fortress of resistance, a place where survivors became advocates. Tomorrow would bring new stories, new challenges, new opportunities to create change. But tonight, In this house that had become so much more than just an inheritance, I felt only gratitude. Dan had tried to write my story, but he'd failed to understand one crucial truth. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we write together, supporting each other, lifting each other up, turning individual pain into collective strength. The evening settled around the Victorian like a protective embrace, its shadows holding not threats but possibilities. In the quiet of my grandmother's study, surrounded by the tools of transformation, I began to plan for tomorrow, not just for myself, but for every woman who would find her way to this sanctuary, seeking shelter in its strength and leaving with the power to reclaim her own story. A text from Sarah lit up my phone. Another bank had agreed to implement protective measures similar to my grandmother's trust requirements. Small victories adding up to systemic change, one institution at a time. Outside, the city lights twinkled. Like stars, each one perhaps marking another woman's journey toward freedom. The Victorian stood ready to guide them home, its doors open, its rooms filled with understanding, its very walls holding stories of survival and triumph. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, in this house that had become a haven for healing, I felt only peace. Dan had tried to destroy me, but instead he'd helped create something stronger than his destruction. A community of women determined to protect each other, support each other, and write new endings to their stories. The manila envelope landed on my desk with a soft thud, interrupting my morning review of foundation applications. Detective Sandra Martinez stood before me, her expression grim. "We found these in a storage unit registered to one of Dan's shell companies. You need to see this." Inside the envelope, dozens of photographs spilled across my grandmother's antique desk. All women, all caught in unguarded moments. Each photo had dates, locations, and detailed notes written on the back in Dan's precise handwriting. A chill ran down my spine as I recognized some of the faces from recent foundation meetings. "He was tracking potential targets," Sandra explained, pulling up a chair. "Your case helped us get warrants to search properties connected to his investment firm. This goes deeper than we thought. He wasn't working alone." My hands trembled as I sorted through the photos. Some dated back nearly a decade, showing women at cafes, shopping, entering their homes, all completely unaware they were being watched. "These women, have they been notified?" Sandra nodded. "We're reaching out to each one, but there's more." She pulled out a laptop, opening files recovered from the storage unit. "He had a network, other financial advisors, lawyers, even a judge who helped cover up these operations. Your grandmother's protections didn't just stop Dan, they exposed an entire predatory system." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My own experience with Dan suddenly felt like just the tip of an iceberg, a small part of something far more sinister. Olivia arrived as Sandra was walking me through the evidence, her legal pad already out and ready. "We need to expand our scope," Olivia said, scanning the files. "The foundation can't just focus on individual cases anymore. We're looking at institutional exploitation. These men created a playbook for targeting wealthy women, and they've been using it for years." Sarah Chen burst into the study, waving printouts of banking records. "You won't believe what we found. The offshore accounts, they're all connected. Dan's firm was running a sophisticated operation, using marriage as a cover for systematic financial exploitation. They even had a rating system for potential targets." The morning sun streaming through the stained glass windows suddenly felt cold. I thought about all the women who'd come through our doors in recent weeks, each sharing stories that seemed uniquely painful, but now revealed themselves as variations on a carefully orchestrated theme. Judge Morgan arrived shortly after, having left court early after hearing about the discovery. Her usual composed demeanor showed cracks of genuine anger as she reviewed the evidence. This explains patterns I've seen in my courtroom for years. Cases that seemed isolated but followed similar scripts. we weren't just dealing with individual predators, this was organized financial terrorism against women. The Victorians' rooms, usually filled with the quiet work of healing and rebuilding, buzzed with urgent energy as we began mapping out responses. Linda and Catherine worked with Sandra, identifying women from the photographs. Marie coordinated with other organizations across the country, discovering similar patterns in other cities. "Look at this," Sarah called from her makeshift workspace. In the library, they had criteria: age, assets, family connections. They specifically targeted women with complicated family relationships, making it harder for them to find support when things went wrong. In the dining room, Olivia led a team of volunteer lawyers, analyzing cases for patterns that might help identify other operations. They were careful, she noted, spreading files across the table. Each case looked different on the surface, but underneath, they followed the same steps: love bombing, isolation, financial control, then total asset seizure. A young woman named Rebecca arrived, clutching a laptop. She'd been helping us build a database of financial abuse cases, and her tech skills had proven invaluable. "I've been running analytics on the patterns," she explained, pulling up complex charts. "There are clusters of cases around certain law firms, investment advisors, even specific banks. It's like they had territories divided up between them." As the day progressed, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. The operation went beyond just targeting wealthy women. It included systematic efforts to block protective legislation, influence judicial appointments, and maintain a network of enablers in positions of power. Margaret, the retired judge who'd worked with my grandmother, arrived in the afternoon. Her eyes filled with tears as she reviewed the evidence. Eleanor suspected something like this. That's why she created those trust protections. She knew individual safeguards weren't enough. We needed systemic change. In the garden, where the late afternoon sun painted shadows through the rose bushes, I found a moment of quiet to process the magnitude of what we'd discovered. My grandmother's voice seemed to whisper through the rustling leaves. "Sometimes, the biggest battles are the ones we don't even know we're fighting." Judge Morgan found me there, holding a fresh stack of documents. "The FBI's involved now. This is going to get bigger before it gets better. Are you ready for that?" The question hung in the air as I watched a group of women leaving the Victorian, their heads held higher than when they'd arrived, their steps more confident. Each one carried a piece of the truth we were uncovering. Each one represented both a victory and a call to action. "We don't have a choice," I replied. These men counted on silence. They built their power on the assumption that shame and fear would keep their victims isolated. But they didn't count on women coming together, sharing their stories, connecting the dots. Inside, the work continued. Rebecca's database grew as more cases were added, revealing patterns that had remained hidden when viewed in isolation. Sarah coordinated with banking regulators, pushing for stronger protections against financial exploitation. Olivia drafted proposals for legislative changes that would make it harder for predators to hide behind legal loopholes. Detective Martinez returned in the evening with more files. "We're finding similar operations in other cities," she reported. "Your foundation's work helped crack this open. Women are coming forward everywhere, recognizing their stories in yours." The Victorian, which had started as a sanctuary for individual healing, was transforming into command central for something much larger. Maps covered walls, showing clusters of cases across the country. Timelines stretched across tables, revealing the careful coordination behind what had appeared to be isolated incidents. As night fell, I sat in my grandmother's study, surrounded by evidence of a battle she'd seen coming long before anyone else. Her letter, found in the trust documents, took on new meaning. The strongest walls aren't just the ones that protect us, but the ones that let us see beyond our own defenses to the bigger picture. Catherine appeared in the doorway, her face showing both exhaustion and determination. "I've been thinking about all the women in these photos," she said softly. Each one chosen because she had something these men wanted to steal. Each one targeted, not just for her assets, but for her potential to be isolated and controlled. Linda joined us, adding another layer to the conversation. It's not just about the money anymore. It's about exposing a system that turns marriage into a weapon, that uses love as a cover for exploitation. We need to change more than just laws. We need to change how society views these crimes. Marie arrived with tea, a small gesture of normalcy in a day that had shaken our understanding of everything. "We should reach out to investigative journalists," she suggested. "The public needs to understand that these aren't just individual cases of marital discord. This is organized crime targeting women's financial independence." As we talked, more women arrived, drawn by urgent texts and calls as news of our discoveries spread. The Victorian's rooms filled again, this time not just with survivors seeking help, but with advocates ready to fight. Each brought skills, connections, and determination to expose what we'd found. Sarah Chen called from her office downtown, where she was still working with her team. "The banking records we've uncovered, they show patterns going back decades. These operations adapted as laws changed, finding new ways to exploit vulnerabilities. But that also means we can trace their evolution, find their weak points." Judge Morgan, who had stayed late to help coordinate with law enforcement, shared news from her colleagues. "Other judges are reviewing cases now, looking for similar patterns. Cases that seemed unrelated are showing clear connections. The whole system of justice is going to have to confront this." As midnight approached, the Victorian gradually quieted, but the energy of discovery and determination lingered in every room. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, new battles to fight. But tonight, in this house that had become so much more than a refuge, we had taken the first steps toward exposing a truth that had hidden in plain sight for too long. The garden roses swayed in the night breeze, their fragrance mixing with the salt air from Elliott Bay. My grandmother had planted them in neat rows, each variety chosen for its resilience as much as its beauty. She'd understood something fundamental about survival, that it requires both strong roots and the ability to reach toward the light. Dan and his network had built their power on the assumption that their victims would remain isolated, their stories untold, their patterns unrecognized. But they'd failed to account for the strength that comes from shared experience, from women supporting women, from truth finally finding its voice. Tomorrow would bring more work, more revelations, more battles to fight. But tonight, in this house that had become a catalyst for change, we had begun to unravel a web of exploitation that had ensnared countless women. Each thread we pulled revealed new connections, new evidence, new opportunities for justice. The Victorian stood silent under the stars, its windows dark except for the study where I continued to work. Inside these walls, we weren't just helping individual survivors anymore. We were exposing a system designed to turn marriage into a weapon of financial destruction. And in doing so, we were writing a new chapter in the story of women's fight for economic freedom. The autumn rain drummed against the Victorian's windows as I reviewed the latest files from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Special Agent Taylor Reeves spread photographs across my grandmother's desk, each showing elegant charity galas and social events where Dan's network had hunted for targets. "These men were methodical," Agent Reeves explained, her fingertip tapping one particular image. "They used high society events to identify wealthy women, especially those recently widowed or divorced. Your ex-husband wasn't just a predator, he was a recruiter, training others in his techniques." Sarah Chen burst into the study, her normally composed demeanor shaken. "We've found something in the banking records. Remember those offshore accounts? They're connected to a private banking network in Switzerland, the same network that handled accounts for Marcus Sterling." The name sent a chill through the room. Marcus Sterling, one of Seattle's most respected investment advisors, had managed billions in assets for wealthy families. He'd also served on the boards of several women's charities, a position that now seemed far more sinister. Judge Morgan arrived minutes later, still wearing her court robes. Sterling's cases just got flagged for review. 3 divorces in the past decade, each following the same pattern we saw with Dan. The women lost everything, and Sterling's firm ended up managing their assets. Olivia was already pulling up Sterling's case files on her laptop. Look at this. He specialized in handling trusts for wealthy widows. His firm even published guides on protecting women's financial interests. It was the perfect cover. The investigation had grown beyond anything we'd initially imagined. What started as exposing one man's crimes had unveiled a sophisticated network of financial predators, all operating under the veneer of respectability. They didn't just steal money, they systematically targeted women's financial independence, using marriage as their weapon. Detective Martinez joined us, bringing coffee and fresh evidence. Sterling's secretary came forward this morning. She's been keeping records, dates, names, conversations she overheard. These men had regular meetings, planning sessions where they discussed potential targets. Rebecca, our database expert, looked up from her computer. I've cross-referenced Sterling's client list with known cases of financial abuse. The overlap is significant. At least 15 women lost substantial assets after being introduced to his investment group. In the dining room, now our makeshift command center, Catherine and Linda worked with other survivors, mapping connections between different cases. Strings crisscrossed a large board, linking names, dates, and events. Each thread represented a woman's shattered life, a fortune stolen, a trust betrayed. Marie entered with a stack of newspapers from different cities. It's happening everywhere. Since our story broke, women across the country are coming forward with similar experiences. Different names, different firms, but the same tactics. The rain intensified outside, matching the storm of information flooding into the Victorian. Every hour brought new revelations, new connections, new understanding of how deep this network reached. These men hadn't just preyed on women, they'd created an industry out of it. Agent Reeves studied the evidence board, her expression grim. This is organized crime, plain and simple. They had hierarchies, territories, training programs for new members. They even had protocols for handling investigations, ways to discredit women who started asking questions. Sarah's phone buzzed with another alert from her banking contacts. Sterling's firm just tried to move a large amount of assets offshore. We've frozen the transfers, but he knows we're onto him. He's going to start destroying evidence. Judge Morgan was already on her phone, coordinating with other judges across jurisdictions. We need search warrants now, not just for Sterling's office, but for every member of his investment group. We have to move before they can hide the evidence. The Victorian had become more than just a sanctuary for survivors. It was now the heart of an investigation that threatened to expose decades of systematic exploitation. Every room held pieces of the puzzle: financial records in the library, victim statements in the sunroom, legal documents spreading across every available surface. As evening approached, more women arrived, bringing their own stories and evidence. A retired accountant who'd worked for Sterling's firm shared internal documents showing patterns of suspicious transfers. A former Society columnist revealed how these men used charity events to identify potential victims. They called it harvesting, the columnist explained, her voice shaking. They would attend these events, looking for women who had recently inherited money or received divorce settlements. They kept lists, rating potential targets based on their vulnerability and asset levels. Detective Martinez organized teams to interview former employees of these investment firms. Many of them suspected something was wrong but were afraid to speak up. Now they're coming forward, filling in the gaps in our timeline. In the garden, where the rain had finally subsided, I found a moment of quiet to process the magnitude of what we were uncovering. My grandmother's roses bent under the weight of raindrops, each flower a reminder of her foresight. She'd created protections not just for me, but for any woman who might face these predators. Judge Morgan joined me, her court robes exchanged for casual clothes. Eleanor would be proud of what we're doing here. She always said that individual cases were just symptoms. We needed to expose the disease itself. Inside, the work continued into the night. Rebecca's database grew more complex, revealing patterns that spanned continents. Sarah coordinated with banking regulators worldwide, tracking the movement of stolen assets through a maze of offshore accounts. Olivia emerged from a conference call with prosecutors in other states. They're starting to connect their own cases to this network. What happened to us wasn't isolated. It was part of a global operation targeting women's wealth. Agent Reeves set up a secure communications center in what had once been the formal living room. We need to coordinate across jurisdictions. These men are sophisticated, well-connected. They'll have contingency plans, ways to disappear their assets and themselves. As midnight approached, Catherine discovered something in Sterling's charity board records. Look at the dates of these board meetings. They align perfectly with when women in our database reported being approached by members of his firm. The charities weren't just cover, they were hunting grounds. Linda, working late on victim impact statements, found another pattern. They specifically targeted women who'd recently lost parents or spouses. They studied obituaries, attended funerals, offered financial guidance when women were most vulnerable. The evidence mounted, painting a picture of calculated cruelty that spanned generations. These men hadn't just stolen money, they'd systematically exploited women's trust, turning grief and vulnerability into profit. Marie coordinated with women's organizations in other countries, discovering similar networks operating across borders. They shared information, warned each other about investigations, helped each other hide assets. It was like a dark mirror of our support network. As the night deepened, the Victorian hummed with determination. In every room, women worked together, piecing together a puzzle that had remained hidden for too long. Each discovery strengthened our resolve. Each connection brought us closer to exposing the full scope of these crimes. Sarah's banking team identified patterns in how the stolen assets were moved. They used a network of shell companies, each layer making it harder to trace the original theft. But they got careless. Success made them sloppy. Agent Reeves coordinated with international law enforcement, preparing for simultaneous raids across multiple countries. We have to move carefully. These men have powerful friends, connections in high places. We need our case to be airtight. In my grandmother's study, surrounded by evidence of decades of exploitation, I felt the weight of what we were undertaking. This wasn't just about justice for individual survivors anymore. It was about dismantling a system that had turned women's financial independence into a target. The Victorian stood strong against the night, its lights burning late into the darkness. Inside these walls, we weren't just helping women recover from abuse. We were exposing the machinery of exploitation itself. Each piece of evidence, each connection we uncovered, brought us closer to understanding the true scope of what we faced. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, in this house that had become command central for an international investigation, we had taken the first steps toward exposing a truth that had hidden in plain sight for generations. The rain returned, gentle now, washing the city clean. In gardens across Seattle, other women's roses bent under the weight of water, just as their owners might be bending under the weight of financial abuse. But here, in my grandmother's garden, the flowers stood straight and strong, ready to weather any storm. Just like the women working inside, united in purpose, determined to expose the truth, no matter how powerful those who wish to keep it hidden might be. Special Agent Reeves's voice crackled through the secure line at exactly 5 a.m. Operations Live. Sterling's been arrested at his Lake Washington mansion. Simultaneous raids happening in London, Geneva, and Singapore. The Victorian's command center erupted into action, dozens of screens lighting up with real-time updates from around the world. Sarah Chen's team at the bank had worked through the night, tracking electronic transfers as the network tried desperately to move assets ahead of the raids. "They're burning their digital trails," she reported, fingers flying across her keyboard. "But we've got mirrors of everything. They can delete all they want. The evidence is secure." Judge Morgan strode into the study, still in her running clothes, cell phone pressed to her ear. "Frankfurt just confirmed. They've detained Heinrich Weber, Sterling's private banker. He's already talking, trying to cut a deal." She paused, listening intently. They found the client lists. All of them. Olivia spread fresh search warrants across the antique desk as Detective Martinez coordinated with local SWAT teams. 5 more properties in Seattle alone, all connected to Sterling's operation. Each raid revealed new layers of the conspiracy: hidden safes full of documents, computers filled with surveillance files, storage units packed with evidence of decades of systematic exploitation. 6 more arrests in Portland, Rebecca called. Out, updating our tracking board. All connected to Sterling's investment seminars. They marketed them specifically to wealthy widows, called them financial independence workshops for women. It was just another hunting ground. The morning. Sun had barely cleared the horizon when Catherine burst in, clutching her tablet. "You need to see this. Sterling's wife is doing a live interview, claiming he's being framed. She's calling us a radical feminist conspiracy." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Another woman being used as a shield by these men, probably unaware that her own fortune was already hidden in offshore accounts under her husband's control. Marie coordinated with international victims advocacy groups as more survivors came forward. A woman in Paris recognized Sterling from the news. He approached her at her husband's funeral last year, offered to help manage her inheritance. She almost fell for it. Linda worked with forensic accountants, tracing patterns in how the network had hidden their stolen assets. They created layers of shell companies, each one designed to look legitimate. But look here, they got lazy, used the same formation agents, the same patterns. Once you know what to look for, it's like following breadcrumbs. The Victorian's rooms buzzed with activity as evidence poured in from raids across 3 continents. In the library, now our digital forensics center, tech experts sifted through encrypted files recovered from Sterling's home office. Each decrypted document revealed new connections, new victims, new perpetrators. Agent Reeves returned mid-morning, her suit slightly rumpled from hours of overseeing arrests. "Sterling's talking. Says he can give us names. Judges, politicians, banking executives who helped cover up the operation. But he wants a deal." Judge Morgan's response was immediate and firm. "No deals. We've got enough evidence to put him away for life. Let him sit in custody while we unravel every thread of this network." Her voice carried the weight of decades watching similar men escape justice through carefully negotiated plea bargains. Sarah's phone buzzed with urgent news from Singapore. They've found a hidden server farm, encrypted drives containing what looks like their entire playbook. How they selected targets, grooming techniques, scripts for their investment advisors to follow. It's all there. Outside, media vans began gathering, drawn by rumors of major arrests. The Victorian's iron gates remained firmly closed, protecting the privacy of the women inside who were finally seeing justice done. Local news helicopters circled overhead, capturing aerial shots of federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from Sterling's waterfront mansion. Detective Martinez coordinated protection details as threats began rolling in. Anonymous messages, suspicious vehicles. Circling the Victorian, attempts to hack our secure networks. "They're scared," she observed, positioning plainclothes officers around the perimeter. And scared men with money and connections are dangerous. By noon, the full scope of the morning's operations became clear. 32 arrests across 9 countries. Hundreds of millions in assets frozen. Decades of carefully constructed facades crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. Olivia emerged from a conference call with prosecutors, her expression grave but determined. They're trying to spin this as a misunderstanding, claiming these were all legitimate business dealings between consenting adults, but the evidence tells a different story. In what had once been the formal dining room, Catherine and Marie helped new survivors process their emotions as the truth about Sterling's network emerged. Women who had blamed themselves for years suddenly realized they had been targeted by sophisticated predators who had turned marriage into a weapon. Rebecca's database continued growing as more connections emerged. Look at this pattern. They had a whole system for identifying potential targets. They monitored obituaries, divorce filings, inheritance cases. Anywhere they might find women with sudden access to wealth and vulnerability. Judge Morgan coordinated with colleagues across jurisdictions, ensuring evidence was properly handled and witnesses were protected. These men have spent decades building influence, buying protection. We have to do this by the book. No mistakes. They can exploit. As evening approached, Sarah discovered something in the encrypted files that made her blood run cold. They had a contingency plan. If they were ever exposed, they were supposed to release compromising information about their victims. Photos, recordings, manufactured evidence of financial misconduct. They're calling it their dead man's switch. Agent Reeves immediately mobilized cyber units to locate and neutralize the threat. Classic intimidation tactic. They think fear will still protect them, but they didn't count on their victims finding their courage, and each other. The Victorian security systems registered another attempt at digital infiltration, this one more sophisticated than previous attacks. Our tech team traced it to a server in the Cayman Islands, another piece of the network revealing itself. As it tried to fight back, Linda worked with international banking investigators, following money trails that wound through dozens of jurisdictions. Every transaction tells a story, she explained, pointing to complex diagrams covering the library walls. They thought they could hide behind complexity, but they actually created patterns we can trace. As night fell over Seattle, the Victorians' lights burned bright, a beacon for truth in the gathering darkness. Inside, women who had once been victims continued working to expose the system that had tried to destroy them. Each piece of evidence cataloged, each connection mapped, brought us closer to dismantling decades of organized exploitation. Olivia coordinated with media teams, ensuring the story couldn't be buried or spun. We're releasing evidence in carefully planned waves, she explained. Each revelation builds on the last, making it impossible for them to dismiss this as isolated incidents. Marie discovered a pattern in Sterling's charity work that revealed another layer of the scheme. These foundations they created, they weren't just for finding targets. They were laundering operations, ways to move stolen assets while looking philanthropic. Catherine worked with trauma specialists, developing programs to help survivors heal from the unique psychological damage inflicted by these predators. They didn't just steal our money, she explained to a group of new arrivals. They tried to steal our trust in ourselves, but we're taking it back. The secure phone line buzzed again. Another update from international law enforcement. A raid in Luxembourg had uncovered physical evidence dating back 30 years. Photographs, documents, recordings, an archive of systematic exploitation that spanned generations. Judge Morgan reviewed the findings with growing anger and determination. This isn't just about financial crimes anymore. This is about a systematic attack on women's economic independence. They saw our wealth as a threat, so they created an industry dedicated to stealing it. Sarah's banking team identified patterns in how the network had evolved over decades. They adapted as laws changed, finding new loopholes, new ways to hide their operations. But that adaptation left traces we can follow. The Victorians' rooms hummed with purpose as midnight approached. In the library, analysts compiled evidence for international prosecutors. The dining room hosted late-night strategy sessions as we planned our response to new threats. The study, my grandmother's sanctuary, became command central for coordinating global operations. Agent Reeves returned from another round of arrests, bringing news that shook us all. Sterling's records name a Supreme Court justice as one of their protectors. They've had help at the highest levels. The implications were staggering. How many cases had been influenced? How many appeals denied to protect this network? Outside, the autumn wind whispered through my grandmother's roses, their late blooms standing firm against the darkness. Inside, women who had survived these predators worked tirelessly to ensure no one else would fall victim to their sophisticated schemes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more threats to counter, more evidence to process, more survivors to support. But tonight, in this house that had become the heart of an international investigation, we had struck a blow against a system that had operated in shadows for far too long. The Victorian stood strong, its lights a promise in the darkness. Inside these walls, we weren't just exposing crimes, we were dismantling the machinery of exploitation itself. Each document cataloged, each connection mapped, brought us closer to our goal, ensuring these predators could never again use marriage as a weapon against women's financial independence. The sunrise painted the Victorians' windows in shades of amber and rose as Judge Morgan delivered the news we'd been anticipating since our crusade began. Every judge who participated in the network's scheme has been identified. The evidence is irrefutable. The Justice Department has no choice but to act. Her voice carried the weight of vindication, of justice finally breaking through decades of corruption. Sarah Chen burst into the study, her laptop displaying real-time updates from financial centers worldwide. The dominoes are falling. Every bank account, every shell company, every hidden asset we flagged is being frozen. They're running out of places to hide. Her team had worked tirelessly, mapping the intricate web of financial deception that had enabled these predators for so long. Detective Martinez coordinated with international law enforcement as simultaneous raids began across 3 continents. The network's key players had gathered for what they thought was a routine strategy meeting at an exclusive Swiss resort. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by Interpol agents, their carefully constructed facades crumbling in real time. The Victorian buzzed with focused energy as reports flooded in. Rebecca managed our secure communications hub, tracking arrests and evidence seizures. Linda documented financial recoveries, her diagrams showing the systematic dismantling of decades of exploitation. Catherine and Marie supported survivors watching their abusers finally face justice. Special Agent Reeves directed operations from what had once been my grandmother's formal dining room, now a command center for coordinating with federal task forces. "Sterling singing like a canary," she announced, a rare smile crossing her face. "He's giving up everyone. Judges, politicians, banking executives. The whole corrupt system is coming down." Olivia managed media responses as the story broke worldwide. Our evidence releases were perfectly timed, each revelation building on the last, making it impossible for the network's allies to spin or suppress the truth. The same newspapers that had once dismissed us as conspiracy theorists now ran front-page exposés confirming every accusation. The Victorians' rooms, which had sheltered so many survivors, now hummed with the energy of victory. In the library, analysts compiled final reports documenting the network's collapse. The sunroom hosted support groups for women watching their abusers face justice. The study coordinated with prosecutors, ensuring every case was airtight. Sarah's team made another crucial discovery in the encrypted files. "They kept trophy photos," she reported grimly. "Documentation of every woman they destroyed. But now, It's evidence of their crimes, proof of systematic exploitation spanning decades. What they'd intended as souvenirs of victory became instruments of their downfall. As evening approached, we gathered in my grandmother's study, surrounded by the evidence of what we'd accomplished. Judge Morgan spread out the latest court orders authorizing the seizure of billions in hidden assets. "These funds will be used to establish a permanent foundation," she explained. "Your grandmother's protections will become standard practice across the industry." The Victorian's gardens offered moments of quiet reflection as reports continued, arriving. Every hour brought news of more arrests, more assets seized, more victims coming forward. The network that had seemed invincible just months ago lay in ruins, its power broken, its members facing justice. Catherine worked with survivors as they processed the magnitude of our victory. "This isn't just about punishment," she reminded them. "This is about changing the system that protected these predators. Your courage made this possible." The women who had once been victims were now architects of lasting change. Linda's team tracked the final financial dominoes falling. Every account we flagged, every transaction we traced, it's all being frozen. They can't hide behind complexity anymore. The patterns are clear, the evidence undeniable. The network's own meticulous record-keeping became the instrument of its destruction. As night fell over Seattle, the Victorian stood peaceful at last, its rooms gradually quieting as the day's intensity wound down. In the garden, where my grandmother's roses still bloomed, I found a moment to reflect on how far we'd come. Judge Morgan joined me there, her court robes exchanged for casual clothes. "Eleanor would be proud," she said softly. "Not just of exposing these crimes, but of creating something stronger in response. This house isn't just a sanctuary anymore. It's a foundation for lasting change." The secure feeds brought updates from around the world as the scope of our victory became clear. Prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions announced plans to strengthen laws against financial exploitation. Banking regulators implemented new protections based on patterns we'd exposed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, helping survivors rebuild, implementing protective measures, educating new generations about financial independence. But tonight, in this house that had become so much more than just a home, we celebrated a victory that would echo through generations. Dan's sentencing hearing was scheduled for next week, but he had become almost irrelevant, just one predator among many, his methods exposed, his power broken. The network he'd served had crumbled, its influence shattered, its members facing justice at last. The Victorian stood quiet under the stars, its windows glowing with welcome. Inside these walls, we had not just won a battle. We had created something that would continue to protect and empower women for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.